Hey everyone, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you may be in the world, and welcome. For today's session, we've got our head of outreach for Cisco Talos, Nick Biasini, and Duo Product Marketing Manager Ganesh Umapathy, who are going to discuss how cyber attackers are bypassing MFA and best practices for preventing these attacks. Just to note, if you guys have any questions during the session, please enter those in the Q&A box, and we'll make sure to save some time at the end to answer those. And we do have a really good group registered today. So first, thank you guys for your interest. And if for some reason we can't cover all of your questions, you can expect an email response from us sometime within the next few business days. You guys can also expect to receive a link to the recording before the end of this week. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass the mic over to Ganesh to get us started.
Awesome. Thank you, Tracy. Again, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in for today's session. I'm very excited to have my colleague here, Nick Biasini, who's going to talk about all the interesting cyber criminal tactics he's seeing in the wild. So let's get started. So here's a quick agenda of how we're going to cover this session. So I'll start with some trends regarding MFA, just set the context, and then we'll dive deep into a podcast-style question-answer interview with Nick. And then we'll close with some best practices you can implement to strengthen your multi-factor authentication solution. So I wanted to start with saying multi-factor authentication is not a new technology, right? It's been around for more than a decade in different forms. But still, year after year, we see in various data breach reports that stolen credentials, stolen passwords is one of the leading vectors for unauthorized access, especially as the SaaS applications and web-based applications increase in an organization's application inventory. And that's why a lot of government agencies like CISA in the US and UK's NCSC recommend using multi-factor authentication, especially for applications that are internet-facing. And you have vendors sharing that they have seen a significant drop in the use of compromised credentials when you turn on multi-factor authentication. Most famous one here being Microsoft mentioned about 3 years ago that a simple multi-factor authentication can prevent over 99% of identity-based account compromise type of attacks. But and it's no wonder that slowly and steadily multi-factor authentication adoption has been increasing in organizations. But now in the last 18 months, we've seen a different set of headlines. Organizations that have had MFA implemented have been breached and have made big headlines. And we are seeing words such as MFA fatigue, social engineering, phishing kits being more shown in these headlines. So what gives? What does it mean for MFA? Is MFA not effective anymore? And that's what we're here to uncover in this conversation. So let's dive into that subject. So Nick, so what are the kind of attack related to MFA in the wild today?
Well, first off, thanks for having me today, Ganesh. So MFA is kind of interesting. At its core, what we've noticed is adversaries are starting to take notice. If you go back 3, 4, 5 years, if attackers were to compromise a set of credentials and realize that MFA was enabled, they would just move on, because there's too many other credentials out there that they could use that don't require the extra level of access. But as we've seen more and more organizations apply MFA, and we're really starting to see the benefits of that, the attackers have definitely started to notice. You mentioned MFA fatigue already. We're seeing lots of social engineering attacks, more and more use of session cookies, and adversaries paying particular attention to those. But generally across the board, what we're seeing is actors have realized that bypassing MFA is going to become a necessity in some environments, especially for those places where hardened targets, those bigger enterprises or enterprises with more high value for them. Additionally, the fact that MFA is becoming more and more prevalent in the personal space, whether it's your email, your own bank account, your social media accounts, the fact that users are becoming more and more comfortable with multi-factor authentication is really helping drive the adoption across the board, because they do understand the importance, how it works, and why they need to do it.
Got it. Yeah, I definitely see it more on the consumer side. If I log into any of my banking application, I'm asked to enter an OTP or do a mobile app notification. So that's definitely increasing presence in B2C, and we've seen that on the B2B side as well. So that leads me to my next question. You talked about social engineering being one of the key tactics. We're seeing a lot of social engineering. What does it actually mean? What do the criminals do?
So at its core, basically what they're doing is trying to use social tactics to extract information from you, something that you wouldn't share otherwise. Now, the ways that they go about doing this is pretty wide and varied. Historically, you would think mostly doing things like having phone calls, where you would have someone call you or ask you to call them back, and then providing you with an elaborate story or something to be able to extract the information from you. But now we really see them going after a lot of different avenues, whether it's phone calls, text messages, instant messaging on various platforms, social media contact. There is a huge variety of ways that attackers are able to approach individuals and kind of launch these social engineering attacks. What's interesting as well is the variety of tactics that they will use in these social engineering campaigns. So I kind of like to say they'll use the carrot and the stick. What I've seen in the past is a lot of times if they manage to get you on the phone, they'll tell you a really like a sob story, something that pulls at your heartstrings, that tries to make you feel bad for them, to convince you to do something that you wouldn't do otherwise. Like, oh no, I made a horrible mistake and I'm in this really bad circumstance, but if you could help me out, I'll be able to get through this. The interesting thing is if that doesn't work, a lot of times they'll pivot to things that are more aggressive. They'll pose as your own security organization, saying things like, there's a potential incident involving your account. We really need you to help us out with this. Or even getting more aggressive and threatening you, saying your job's on the line. It's very, very important that you do these particular things that we're asking you to do. In this case, it's bypass MFA, but it could be hand over your username and password, click on this link, open this attachment that we're sending you. There's a huge variety of avenues for both the ways that they can launch these attacks, the tactics that they can use to make them successful, and the end result that they're going after.
Got it. So it looks like it's basically trying to take the victim into confidence and tricking them into performing an action that they would normally otherwise don't do, like whether it's using the sob stories like you mentioned, or kind of using an urgency, like, hey, you need to do it now, this coming from the boss, the CEO, and things like that.
Yep, absolutely. They'll even threaten legal action. They'll pretend to be lawyers. There's lots of things that they'll do to try and convince you. There's really no end. I've seen business email compromise campaigns where they pretended to be at hospice, giving things to cancer patients to convince people to do things. There's really no end to the lengths to which they'll go.
Got it. Yeah, I had first-hand experience of this. When I first came to the US, I was a student, and within the very first month or 2 months, I got a call. Someone's calling from IRS saying I owed taxes, and I said I had just got into the country, so it was very, very surreal about the things that were happening, and we were just advised not to pick those calls. So it's definitely very real.
Yep, absolutely.
And then you talked about when it comes to multi-factor authentication, you mentioned MFA fatigue. What is it? What is MFA fatigue actually? Is it people getting tired of MFA? What is it?
So effectively what this is once attackers have obtained your credentials, your username and password, they will log in and then launch a constant barrage of MFA push notifications to your phone. And when I say a constant barrage, I mean hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, all hours of the day and night, constantly barraging your phone. And you may say, well, what's the big deal with that? But you have to realize that you're getting notification after notification on your phone over and over again. It effectively makes your phone unusable. And additionally, how do you log in when you're going through these MFA fatigue attacks? If you're getting hundreds and hundreds of pushes thrown at you, how do you know which one is the one that is yours, that you're initiating, versus those that are coming from the attacker? Additionally, users have a tendency to think that it's a technological problem. So they may just look at it like, oh, there must be something broken with MFA. Let me just hit accept so I think I can get rid of these. And unfortunately, it works a really high percentage of the time. So what you're seeing is attackers are using this more and more and getting more and more aggressive with it, doing hundreds and hundreds of pushes, say in the middle of the night at 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, to where your phone is constantly buzzing. And if you're someone who has a kid or an elderly parent that you're concerned about, you can't just mute your phone or turn it off. You just have this constant drone of notifications coming in. And I can imagine it would be pretty fatiguing after a while.
Got it. Yeah, I can imagine myself, if I experience this, I can imagine myself going, hey, just make it stop, and I'll do anything to just make it stop, kind of a scenario. But
yeah, and if you look at it too, we often see both of these scenarios tied together. Like if you think the Cisco incident from several months ago, we saw both elements of MFA fatigue as well as social engineering. They had the same type of tactics where they were going to use the stick and the carrot. I can't get into a lot of details, but as we discussed in the blog, they did absolutely use MFA fatigue attacks to some level of success. And they also use social engineering as a mechanism to try and bypass the MFA protections that we had in place.
Got it. And for the audience that who are curious to read the blog, we'll share the link after this session. It's a very interesting blog on what happened and the steps that we have taken as an organization to mitigate such instances from reoccurring. So yeah, thanks for sharing that, Nick.
Yeah, absolutely. And keep in mind, social engineering attacks are becoming more and more common. Yes, the Cisco incident is one example, but we are far from the only organization that's been dealing with social engineering attack fallout. Lapsus has been heavily using social engineering. Microsoft, one of their compromises they discussed in their blog, social engineering was involved. A year or two ago, we saw Twitter impacted by a very large social engineering attack. It's becoming a lot more prevalent as time goes on.
Got it. Thanks for sharing that. Yeah, it's not a concern for just any single organization. It's like looks like social engineering. They're targeting these specific high-value targets that you mentioned earlier. Got it. And then you talked about another type of attack. You talked about social engineering, MFA fatigue, but there was a third one. You talked about stealing session cookies. What does it mean? Is it the same as man in the middle? What is it?
So basically, the easiest way to do this is to explain how web sessions work in your browser. So if you log in, you go to a website in your web browser. As an example, you go to your local webmail, whatever your webmail is that you use to check. When you authenticate to that website and you log in, they store something on your computer called a session cookie. This effectively prevents you from having to log in over and over again. So say, for instance, you accidentally close the tab and you reopen it again. You notice that how when you go back to the tab, your session is still established. You don't have to re-log in again. That's exactly what the purpose of session cookies are. However, adversaries have noticed that these are just files on your file system. So if we can find them, take them, and copy them onto our own systems, we can then open a session to that same web page and be logged in as you. So now you're bypassing not just the username and password, but any MFA protections that may be in place. And we're really starting to see adversaries look to this more and more. You mentioned before info stealers. One of the things that we've noticed is info stealers have started to evolve to kind of look for these session cookies. Info stealers tend to kind of sit on the cutting edge of credentials or value targets as far as information is concerned. About 6 months or a year ago, we started to see them actively start to look really deeply in the crypto space, where they were looking for wallet addresses, any type of logins tied to any type of crypto exchanges and things like that. And now we're starting to see the same type of evolution happen toward session cookies. They're starting to look for them on the file system, actively exfiltrate them out, but it's by far from the only way that adversaries can get access to these cookies. If they have a remote access Trojan or any way to establish access into that system, they can search for these files, find them, copy them off, and quickly be able to launch attacks with the access. And remember, it's not just your email. This could be your corporate intranet. Anything that's accessible from the internet that you have to log into, they can steal the cookie for and potentially be able to steal your session, and something that we call adversary in the middle. Little different than man in the middle, but similar.
Well, yeah, who would have thought, like, you talked about, like, if I close my browser session and I open it again, I do it many times, and many times I accidentally close my tab and it's like, oh no, I need one more report, pull one more report from Salesforce, and I open it. It's nice that I don't have to log in again, but with that productivity and frictionless experience comes the risk aspect as well, like that cookie can be stolen. That's so interesting on how cybercriminals are evolving the tactics here.
Well, it's always a balance, right? You're always in this constant back and forth between usability and security. And you want to make it usable so that the user doesn't have to type in their username and password and wait for an MFA push every single time they go to a website, especially for something that you visit often. You mentioned Salesforce, your corporate email, some internal resources that you have. You may access those 10, 15, 20 times a day. And it makes sense to not have to require you to put it in all those times. Unfortunately, the bad guys have figured out a way to take advantage of it.
Yep. That's so interesting. So what does all this mean for MFA? We talked about social engineering, MFA fatigue, and stealing session cookies. What does it mean? Is the MFA not secure anymore? Do organizations not look at MFA anymore?
I think what it really says more than anything else is MFA is working. You're starting to see more and more adoption, and adversaries have realized if we don't address MFA and try and figure out ways to bypass it, the amount of victims that we have is going to continue to get smaller and smaller. And like I mentioned before, the fact that it's getting pushed so heavily in the consumer side is another reason why adversaries are looking at it, because you can't compromise a Facebook account. You can't compromise, a social media account, an email account, anything anymore without potentially having to account for MFA. What's interesting is the way that I look at it is if an organization hasn't implemented MFA, they should be implementing it as quickly as they possibly can, because it definitely will help reduce the value of the credentials should they be stolen, and hopefully help you identify any potential issues that are happening with bypass attacks or various other things before the user is able to gain access. I mean, look at it this way, those MFA fatigue attacks, these other things that we're talking about are warning signs that credentials have been compromised. Without MFA, you don't have any idea, and the user, that bad guy, is just logging in and doing the damage that they need to do. I will say for those that have implemented MFA, maybe it's time to start looking at ways to improving it in some ways, or kind of hardening it to prevent some of the bypass techniques that we've talked about. And we mentioned things like MFA fatigue. There are things that you can do around that to try and help make that a little less effective, prevent the ability for them to do pushes. We're going to talk more about these types of protections that you can do, adding identifiers for the sessions when you log in. There's things that you can do to help make your MFA a little more secure. But I will say, without a doubt, the most important aspect of rolling out MFA is educating your users. Talk to them about, why are we doing this? What is the reasoning behind it? What does it help protect? How does it work? And most importantly, what do you do when certain things happen? What's normal and what's not? What are things that the organization is never going to do? Make it clear that your security team is never going to call you and say, hey, I'm going to initiate a push request to your phone that I need you to accept. That is very, very, very rarely going to happen. And likely there would be many, many, many steps before you ever got to that point. Likewise, they're unlikely to come at you with sob stories about what's going on. It's just not something that most organizations should be dealing with. And it really does come down to user education. And make sure that they know. Like, if they start getting 500 MFA fatigue or MFA pushes, call somebody. Contact your security team and probably figure out a way to reset your password, because at that point you realize that your credentials have absolutely been compromised.
Got it. That you hit the nail on the head there, like user education. Again, it's easy to relate to B2C because that's what most of our users use in our day-to-day life. And again, when I use the example of banking apps, when I log in, I get a text message with an OTP. And usually it's including some information like, hey, the bank will never call you asking for sensitive information like passcodes or SSN, so you should never share those with anyone on the call. even if it's from the bank. So yeah, in that kind of information education, letting the users know that IT teams and security teams will never do this. So be aware of those things. That'll go a long way. Cool. And then switching a little bit, so we know that, okay, we want to protect users' identities, prevent account compromises. And you mentioned the info stealers steal session cookies and put it on their own endpoints or devices and log in. So with that respect, there's the device coming into play as well here into the access scenario. So why is patching device or verifying devices before the login important, especially today, because Microsoft has Patch Tuesday. Every second Tuesday of the month, you get security updates typically. And you've seen, I use Mac for work, and I've seen a lot of Mac updates recently. So why is it important?
Well, you have to think about it in terms of what you're doing, right? MFA is a form of authentication. When you authenticate a user to resources on your network, you really need to understand you're exposing yourself to risk. Every time someone externally accesses something that is internal to your network, it's exposing you to potential risk. As a result of that, there are some things that you can do before allowing that access to occur. Patching is one of the easiest things to do because the more patches that are applied, the less likely it is to be vulnerable to various types of exploitation, the more you realize that the user is up to date on their security patches. I mean, obviously, you may not have to have every security update in the world, but if you have a user that's attempting to connect that is still vulnerable to something like Eternal Blue, that should be a huge red flag to you. For those of you that don't know, Eternal Blue was the vulnerability that was used in WannaCry and NotPetya, the worms that wreaked havoc on the internet several years ago. Those types of vulnerabilities you really need to make sure are patched. Additionally, looking at device checking, doing things like, okay, does the device have a firewall on? Is it configured properly? Does the device have antivirus or anti-malware or endpoint protection installed? Are the signatures up to date? When was the last time a scan was run? How many users are on this system? Are there weird administrator accounts? What types of connections? Seeing what types of connections are existing on those systems. There's lots of things that you can do to help ensure the security of the device. Taking it even a step further, is this a managed device? Is this a device that we already have a level of visibility into? These are all things that can help ensure that the amount of risk you're exposing yourself to is lessened. And keep in mind, too, from patching perspective, after you authenticate a user to your network, it's now part of your network. If an adversary realizes that you have a bunch of vulnerabilities exposed, or you maybe have RDP open to the internet, these are avenues that they can take to gain access to these systems. And if you aren't doing proper checking, you could be letting a very sophisticated adversary into your network and allowing them to access resources of whatever the user has. And in today's hybrid world, you have users of every level connecting remotely. It's not like before where you may have like a sales force that's connecting in remotely or technicians that are out in the field that are connecting remotely. This is everyone from the CEO to the engineers, to the administrators, to the system administrators, to HR. Everyone now is connecting remotely. So making sure that you have this level of visibility is incredibly important, especially as BYOD continues to be a thing and people want to be able to connect from multiple devices. Taking it a step further too, remember, this isn't exclusive to just PCs and laptops. This includes phones and tablets as well. You're able to do checks to make sure that like Android devices aren't rooted, or you don't have a jailbroken iPhone trying to connect. These are all very important checks that organizations need to do to help protect themselves. In the end, exposing yourself to risk is a responsibility of the security organization, so you need to do your due diligence. Make sure that the users that are connecting have their patches installed, their systems are properly configured. Ideally, they would be managed, but obviously that's not always possible. But making sure that they have the proper security protections in place and have a proper security posture to really help reduce the risk that you might be facing.
Got it. Yeah, the one point you made about Eternal Blue and ransomware attacks earlier, that made me think of an article I was reading a few months ago. Somewhere I read like over 70% or some really high percentage of number of laptops or devices that were compromised due to WannaCry ransomware were running Windows 7. And at the time, Windows 7 was way past its end of life. So that's, yeah, that's just crazy on how we let some of the simple things that we could do to prevent these kind of attacks not accomplish them easily.
And that's another good point too. There's huge amounts of out of support or even pirated versions of software out there. So making sure that your users are using like current legitimate versions of Windows and your software that you use is also incredibly important, because a pirated version of software could easily have some sort of malware or other malicious intent embedded inside of it.
Absolutely right. Cool. So coming back to MFA, now it's important to verify devices, and we wanted to verify users' identities. So how is this MFA going to affect phishing now? Like, we've seen an evolution in tactics. What's the overall effect MFA is having on the cyber criminals executing these phishing attacks?
What's interesting is we've really started to see the phishing kits finally start to catch up. The phishing kits are basically the frameworks that these actors use to compromise credentials. They're the fake version of your Office 365 login, or the fake version of your Gmail login, or the fake version of your company's VPN login, depending on the sophistication level of the attacker. These phishing kits are finally starting to really acknowledge the fact that they need to start harvesting MFA codes. It is difficult too, because a lot of the time the codes are time sensitive, so they're trying to figure out ways to get users to do this. In some cases, they're even proxying the connections in near real time, so that they authenticate, they then get the MFA push, they push you to another screen saying, please provide your code that was just pushed to your device, and then they're harvesting that information in. Attackers are really getting better and better at trying to capture ways to bypass the MFA that is very effective in preventing those credentials from having as much value. Likewise, it's a financial decision for them. You know, these phishers are typically out there trying to gain as many credentials as they can so that they can sell them to other parties so that they can use them in further attacks, right? So by having the ability to bypass MFA, to having validated access, or potentially even establishing access beyond MFA. That's one of the things that we'll see as well, is once these users do bypass MFA, one of the first things that they try to do is either disable MFA for that account or figure out a way to try to enroll one of their own devices so that they're able to kind of get their own push. So now, once they have access, instead of it sending a push to your device, it's sending a push to their device. So now they don't have to rely on you anymore. They now have completed a full bypass of MFA because they've enrolled a rogue device in the MFA program. That's one of the first things that we'll see these types of adversaries do. And it's starting to show up all the way down in phishing kits, which is kind of like the lowest level of attacking in this perspective, because you're not actively attacking a target, you're just trying to extract information from users. Oh, another interesting note too, in the email space, we've actually started to see more generic spam move to social engineering. We'll see things like invoice spam, which is like one of the most basic forms of spam that basically says, hey, you purchased something. In the past, you would have an attachment or a URL. The attachment would typically have like a macro that would execute and download some malicious payload, or a URL that would accomplish something similar. What we're seeing now is none of that. There's no attachment, there's no URL, there's literally just a phone number. That's the only thing that's in the document, is please call this phone number. All they're trying to do is get you on the phone, because as soon as they have you on the phone, they know that they have a potential victim. And the folks that do this are very, very good. I mean, that the people that talk on the phone, that do social engineering, are shockingly good at this. Don't expect someone to get on there and have broken English and not be using correct grammar or saying things that don't make sense. These people are very, very well versed in whatever language. They also aren't going to be exclusive to English. They're very, very comfortable speaking in multiple different languages. You could easily have someone call you and start speaking to you in Spanish or whatever other language in the region that the attacker is operating. These groups are making lots and lots of money, especially the ransomware cartels. They're very well funded. They're very well versed in how to launch these attacks, and they're going to come at you with everything they got.
All right. Thanks for explaining that. This is something new to me as well. And just this morning, I'm not even joking, I got an email. Like most people, I have a couple of different email addresses. And I got an email to one of them from PayPal saying someone requested money from me, like $550. It was like, I don't know this person. And there was no other information in that email. It looked completely legit. It seems all the branding elements, everything, there's no typos. And it just says, if you don't recognize this transaction, call this number. And that number is a very big font. So yeah, what you mentioned now, it like completely experienced it this morning.
Yep, and they'll immediately start asking you for things like, oh, I can check on that for you. I just need you to provide your username and password to your PayPal account. And this is exactly the type of attacks that they launch. And unfortunately, these folks, once they get people on the phone, in a lot of ways, they've already won the battle, right? You already believe that there's something going on. You're willing to reach out and contact them. They know that they already have a highly likely victim, and they're going to use the best script they can. They're going to use the carrot or they're going to use the stick. They're going to figure out a way to get you to give them the information that they need.
Yeah. Thanks for explaining that.
Mm-hmm.
So what should organizations do? We've talked about all these attack techniques and trying to bypass MFA. So what should organizations do to prevent these kind of attacks?
So there's a variety of things. I mean, we mentioned user education. That's probably one of the most important. It's not necessarily going to prevent it, but it's going to help your users to notify you when it happens. And that's half the battle, right? You want to know what's going on so that you can operate in a good state. I mentioned as well doing things like having managed devices, and you're going to get more into this, but making sure that you have the devices that are accessing your networks are secure. That's going to help you prevent rogue devices from connecting, right? If you only allow managed devices, if somebody tries to connect without a managed device, they're not going to be able to get in. Looking at things like the ways in which you allow the MFA to occur. I'm old school. I've been in the industry for, let's not talk about how long. I remember the days when we used to only have hardware tokens with recurring digits on them, where you didn't even have push mechanisms to do, and you had to carry dedicated hardware devices. In some cases, maybe in very high security environments, you could look at doing like something like that, or using like certificate-based or the FIDO to the hardware keys that kind of require you to have that physical thing, right? With multi-factor authentication, it's usually something you know and something you have. In this case, it would allow you to have a secondary piece of equipment that you would have to have. So pushing a button gets you there, but you need to have the key in the system to be able to actually authenticate. There are a large variety of different mechanisms that you can do, and I'll let you go deep on specific things that you can do to strengthen your MFA. But again, user education, making sure that you have even making sure that you have good patch programs in place. You know, the things that reduce your risk on systems are going to inherently reduce your risk of things associated with MFA bypass. But obviously, you at Duo have a good list of things that organizations can try.
Yeah, so thanks for sharing those techniques. I think 3 things that stood out for me was user education, move to more strong authentication factors like FIDO2 or hardware keys, and third one was making sure you have a good patching program. I think those are like 3 solid advices to organizations that want to prevent these kind of attacks. So again, like you mentioned earlier, it's not a technology. MFA bypass is not a technology kind of problem. It's more of an implementation and people processes problem, not the technology problem.
The one thing organizations could look at as well is look at what timeouts you have for your sessions. Like we mentioned session cookies, maybe look at reducing the window for session cookies for certain things, making it so they expire or age out more quickly. That could be one thing that organizations could do to help reduce that specific avenue of attack, to make it so that they have to operate very quickly. You don't want a session cookie that expires after 14 days. Maybe you need one that expires after 12 hours.
That's a great point, Nick. And I'll get into a little more like product specific best practices you can do to strengthen your MFA. But Nick pointed out a really interesting thing about reviewing the session lengths that you have in your tools. And just a point on that, Duo just rolled out an update where we are updating a lot of our default settings to a more secure default settings. Like, for example, we had letting all authentication options be available or enabled for enrolled users, but now we're going to just allow secure authentication factors, and I'll talk a little more about that in the next coming slides. But yeah, thanks so much. Anything else that you wanted to add?
No, just again, MFA and social engineering are really big attack trends right now. We're seeing tons of groups focus on MFA bypass using things like MFA fatigue and social engineering, Cisco included. It is a very, very big problem out there. We spent decades telling users don't click links and don't open attachments, but we really should have also said don't call people, don't pick up the phone, don't answer text messages, because now what we're seeing is adversaries are moving to those avenues we missed.
Got it. That's a great point. Cool. So thanks, Nick. And Nick will stick around for the rest of the presentation for any Q&As. But over the next 10 minutes, I would like to take you through some best practices you can implement in your MFA solution. This is not really Duo specific, but it applies more to Duo on how you can strengthen your multi-factor authentication. The first one is we just talked about, moving to more stronger, secure authentication methods. So absolutely no more phone calls or SMS OTPs for MFA. That's the number one authentication factors that cyber criminals use. CIS has come out saying or NIST has come out saying you no longer regard SMS as safe. And we're seeing this change in tactics where MFA fatigue, we just discussed on that, is trying to push users to approve a fraudulent notification. So that's moved towards the lower level of trust. So we want to recommend organizations and users to start using more of push with number matching. Here at Duo, we call it verified Duo push. So this mitigates a lot of those MFA phishing fatigue attacks, because now you don't just get a push notification on your enrolled mobile device, you also get a code on your browser that you're trying to log into. And that way, it ensures that the user the legitimate user who's trying to log in to the service is in possession of both the mobile authenticator and the access device, the browser session itself. So we know that the user is logging in. It's not some fraudulent user trying to send push notifications. So that's a really cool new feature that we recently launched. And today we have FIDO2. FIDO2 is an open standard by the FIDO Alliance, and it uses cryptographic keys to authenticate users with a web service. So FIDO2 has emerged as the gold standard now. It's referred to as phishing-resistant authentication because it mitigates MFA fatigue and also mitigates some of the session cookie stealing attacks. So because there's nothing shared over the browser, and it's always checking if the device is authentication device is tied to the session that's being logged into. So there's a strong channel binding, we call it as, and origin binding. You can't log into a fake website, and there's no shared secrets. So those are the three components that make it phishing-resistant authentication factor. So use push with number matching or FIDO2 wherever possible, especially for admin accounts and sensitive applications. We definitely recommend using only those two authentication factors. And then applying device defense in depth with device trust. We talked about how important it is to get visibility into devices. And I'm sorry, I have a little bit of cough going on. Yeah, it's important to gain visibility into those devices and making sure they're up to date, have the right security settings defined by your organization. So device trust at the time of authentication helps you layer on to that user authentication, making sure only secure, compliant, or managed devices log in. Again, for sensitive applications, admin accounts, we want to ensure that users are logging in only from managed accounts. So this, again, prevents users that are trying to steal cookies, cyber criminals that are trying to steal cookies and place those cookies in their own devices. Those devices will not be able to meet the device trust requirements that you've set. So it mitigates those kind of more advanced, sophisticated attacks. So definitely look at implementing device trust. And the third one being, okay, we understand not all users will have access, not all organizations will have the budget necessary for FIDO2 security keys and rolling out Touch ID for authentication to some, it's IT resource intensive and capital intensive. So we would recommend implementing verified geo push, which is push with number matching. But it increases friction to some extent. If every time a user wants to log into an application, and he's asked to enter, not just approve a push, but now enter code, it increases that user friction a little bit. So we recommend implementing a risk-based authentication approach. So what risk-based authentication does is it dynamically steps up authentication to a more secure factor based on a change in risk signals. Those risk signals could be your device posture, or it could be a location address, or a cool new risk signal that we've announced, we've developed in-house called Wi-Fi fingerprint. What Wi-Fi fingerprint does is it is a solution to a more better location kind of signal, because IP addresses can easily be masked by using a VPN service or something like that. So it's not very reliable. With Wi-Fi fingerprint, we can check the access device, the Wi-Fi signals that the access device is seeing, and generate a fingerprint. And if that fingerprint changes, that means the location has changed, and we need you to re-authenticate because of that. And then that is one of the signals going into the outcomes, which is making sure that the user authenticates in a more secure manner. So this kind of takes away some of those static policies that people have implemented and adjusts risk based on each login scenario. And it also helps in providing the more seamless frictionless experience for users. So again, balancing that risk, productivity, and security. The next thing you can do is monitor for anomalous or risky behavior. Nick talked about how users are trying to, once they bypass MFA, they're trying to enroll their own devices or access from a new device. So that's potentially an early warning signal, hey, that something is off. So maybe this person was not supposed to be in your network. So what do you do? So there are tools in place that can alert you if you have any kind of such security incidents or events. So make sure you're taking a look at that. And the next one is making sure your users are empowered, right? I talked about user education. So what should they do if there's something that they're seeing something that's not typical or usual? So having a mechanism for users to report fraudulent notifications to IT is very important. And this way you are extending your security team, right? Every user becomes a part of your security team now. And they're able to, they're your eyes and ears giving you signals on, hey, if something is going on, you need to take a look at it. So that's very important. So the key takeaways from today's presentation is MFA is still one of the most effective security controls to mitigate account compromise and identity-based attacks. And then we want to ask users and organizations to move towards more stronger authentication factors, like verified geo push or FIDO2 authenticators possible. Definitely add device trust or device verification at the time of authentication, making sure only secure and managed devices gain access into your applications and networks. And implement risk-based authentication. This is to provide the balance between security and usability, and again, adjust authentication based on risk. And last but not the least, Nick hit the nail on the head on this. It's very important to educate users and create a security culture within the organization so everybody knows what they're doing and why they're doing. So with that, we can open it for Q&A. If you love today's session and want to try out Duo, we have a 30-day free trial to test out all the different capabilities I just talked about. So go ahead, https://signup.duo.com, and you can get access to 30-day free trial. With that, Tracy, do we have any questions for today?
Yeah, thanks, Ganesh. Thanks, Nick. We do have a lot of really good questions that have already started coming in. So I'll reiterate what I did at the beginning. If we don't get to cover all of your questions in the next 15 minutes, you can expect to receive an email from us with a response. And I've gotten several questions too about the recording being available. So yes, you guys will all receive an email with a link to the recording within the next 24 hours. So we will go ahead and start. So I'm assuming with the Duo app, hackers are not able to create MFA fatigue by using Duo to send a push. Is this true?
So yeah, we have an in-house app testing team. So our mobile authenticator app goes through a strong security testing process. So typically the way MFA fatigue attacks take place, like I'll let Nick answer maybe more in detail, is not by hacking the application, but by sending an authentication request to the application itself. So there's nothing wrong with the application. It's not been hacked. There's no vulnerability in the application, but it's just a user trying to log in because they were able to find that user's username and password on the dark web somewhere. So they were able to log into that application, and by a typical multi-factor authentication workflow, their mobile authenticator app gets a notification. So this happens in a repeated behavior. Nick, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, think about it this way. You can script this out. So you can make it so that it will just bombard with authentication requests. They already have your username and password, so they already have some valid pieces of information. It just allows them to just create a huge amount of authentication requests and generate those push responses. There's nothing app-wise that you can do about it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah, but one security control to mitigate that is using the push with number matching or verified Duo push. So it's an enhancement and more secure form of push notification that I just talked about. So what it does is it displays not just the notification, but also a prompt to enter a numerical code. And this code is displayed in the browser that the user is trying to log in from. So the user needs to be in front of the access device, logging in from the browser, have it open to see the code on the browser, and then input it into the authenticator application. So this makes sure it is the user, he is in possession of both the access device and the authenticator application, and there's no MFA fatigue kind of going on. So it's a big way to thwart those kind of MFA fatigue attacks. So the verified Duo push is something that you want to use to mitigate those MFA fatigue attacks.
Awesome. All right. What is an example of an equivalent compensating control for MFA?
So it's a multi-factor authentication. There's a lot of alternatives that you can use. It's something you have or something you are. So you could use biometrics as another way to do it. We talked about using physical security keys. There are other ways that you can do it. The important thing is it's an additional form of authentication beyond just a username and password.
Yeah, and I'd like to take a spin on that question as well. So traditionally, what we've talked about, the way we think about MFA is protecting the passwords, right? So it's password-based MFA. We know passwords have been used for ages to log into applications. All the application systems are designed and built in a way to allow access through username and password. But we are at a stage now where we can securely enable passwordless. So if you're at a stage where you can roll out biometrics, like Nick mentioned, like Mac Touch ID or Windows Hello, or you have the resources to roll out FIDO2 security keys, then you might be able to move to a more passwordless authentication factor. So that using FIDO2 authentication is phishing resistant, as I mentioned. So you can go passwordless too, and that could compensate for all these the types of attacks that we discussed today.
Cool. Thanks, guys. So we got hit with an AITM phishing attack a few weeks ago, and it looks like the user didn't even have to enter credentials. So they're curious if you guys have seen anything like this before.
So adversary in the middle typically implies a session cookie being stolen. That can be obtained through a variety of mechanisms. So the system could have been compromised via an info stealer. There could have been a rat dropped on the system. That and any variety types of malicious payloads that would allow the adversary to take the cookie. That would be the thing that they would need.
Yeah,
Cool.
If they have the cookie, then I don't think they would need to log in again, right? Nick?
Yep, correct. Once they have the cookie, there's no username and password required. They're just stealing an already established session.
Got it. And yeah, there's two other kind of follow-up questions on that related to session cookies. So one is, what is the best way to prevent your session cookies from being stolen? And the other is, how do you eliminate session cookie use?
So the first question, it kind of depends on the configuration of the session that you're authenticating to, right? It's when the cookie ages out would be the way that you do that. The way that you eliminate session cookies as being a risk is you don't use session cookies, but realize that your users are going to have to authenticate every single time they go to the web page. And for some users, that could be 20, 30, 40, 50 times a day. So that it's a balance. You don't want to have super frustrated users not wanting to access resources, but you also don't want to open the door for adversaries. So the best option is probably trying to figure out ways to mitigate that risk, either when you completely close out of the browser, destroy the cookie, or when after 10 hours, 12 hours, kill the cookie. There are a couple of different ways that you can mitigate that risk. But yeah, the easiest solution is lower the risk, or else you're going to have a bunch of unhappy users if you try to remove session cookies altogether.
Yep. And just to add on to that, it's again finding the balance between security and productivity, right? So session cookies are there to help users get access to the application. So definitely review based on your risk threshold, what's the level of, what's the right time period or duration of the session cookie you want to enable. And when you're using more stronger authentication controls, that can mitigate some of these cookie attacks. Even if you have authenticators enabled, such as FIDO2 authenticators or biometrics, or if you have device trust where you're allowing access only from managed devices, those are some compensating controls that can help prevent these attacks, even if adversary steals a cookie, because they're not able to log in from a device that's not in the corporate MDM, or they're not able to authenticate using the biometrics that it is typically enrolled.
Cool. Thank you, guys. If cache file is copied, will it auto capture the Google Authenticator plugin accounts?
That I actually don't know offhand, unfortunately. That's a little bit too far in the weeds for that one particular topic. I don't know offhand, unfortunately.
Okay, no worries. Thank you. All right. We are in the finance sector, and our agents are not allowed to have cell phones at their desk per government regulation. So I guess they're asking kind of what would be the best workaround for that.
So we've talked about the physical keys. Those FIDO keys are probably going to be your best authentication avenue that doesn't require that. Those are typically, or some other sort of physical token that you have to carry that's different from your phone. I've worked in those environments before, and we had tokens that we had to carry in because we weren't allowed to use cell phones. It is something that can be used.
Cool, thank you. Are tools like Authenticator considered tokens or OTP?
I can take a stab at that one. So authenticated applications can function both ways, right? They send us a push notification, or they can serve up a mobile passcode. So it depends on what kind of authentications you enable in your control. It can serve as both.
Okay. And there's kind of a two-part question here. So this person's saying that their bank does not use MFA, and they're asking if being on a VPN is sufficient protection, or if they need to find some alternatives.
It really depends on personal risk. The VPN is really designed from to prevent people from being able to snoop the traffic that you're looking at, but your traffic to your bank should already be encrypted in an SSL or a TLS tunnel, so that there's not a ton of value in a VPN on top. You're basically encrypting already encrypted traffic. It really is down to your own individual risk profile. If you're concerned and you're worried about someone gaining access to your banking credentials, then having the ability to turn on MFA provides you that extra level of support, but that really is a decision for each individual user.
Yeah, cool. I would recommend definitely looking at, if you're especially in the banking sector, it's typically regulated. There's a lot of compliance and regulation requirements that banks need to meet. So definitely look at those, because every single regulation, industry regulation, cybersecurity, insurance requirements, they all ask for a strong multi-factor authentication in their IT environment. So especially for something like remote access, even if you're using VPN, how do you protect login to VPN? In fact, MFA for VPN is one of the #1 use cases that we see in our customer base. They typically start with protecting their VPN with MFA, because that's one thing that users log in from any place. So definitely look into the regulations requirements. And the second thing I would like to highlight is, if you're in the US, CISA has a catalog of bad practices. There's just 3 bad practices, and it's a lot of what Nick mentioned earlier today. One is not enabling MFA for anything that's available on internet facing, that users can log in remotely, and not patching softwares and not educating users. So it's like, so if you want to comply with those kind of regulations and requirements and government standards, definitely look at MFA is my take on it.
Okay. Just to confirm, if a home user device is not connected to the domain or has any management software, but it does have Duo Health installed, is there a way to use Duo Trusted Devices?
Yeah, so if I understand the question correctly, you have personal devices that are being used to access. So Duo is definitely built to be BYOD friendly. So we can verify the health posture on any device, even personal devices or third-party contractor devices, using our device health application, which is a lightweight application that's downloaded and sits on your access device. And at the time of authentication, makes sure that you have updated operating system, you have the host firewall turned on, password set, encryption turned on, things like that. And organizations can set what's the minimum required operating system level and minimum required security settings to allow access from a personal device. So this is kind of like having that middle area where you're not requiring users to enroll in a full-blown MDM. Where typically we see users don't want to enroll their personal devices in MDM. But at the same time, we are giving a little, somewhat of a visibility into what devices accessing corporate applications and some kind of security control, making sure that these devices meet the security standards described by the organization. Another way you can do is elevating the trust is, okay, this user is logging from their personal device. So asking them to register and providing some device identifiers. That way organizations can mark those device identifiers and allow access from specific devices for those users as well. So that's some of the ways you can enable device trust from personal device.
Awesome. I got another question on session cookies, which you guys may have touched on in one of the last answers, but how can we monitor for malicious session cookie query activity and exfiltrated cookies?
So you would probably be looking at the attacker accessing the folders where cookies are stored. That's probably your best indicator that there's problems, is if you start seeing queries to those folders or files being copied out of those folders. Those are going to be your key indicators that something may be afoot. But it is difficult to detect when it's being used, because it is just like they're already connected to the session. So there's really no way for you to identify, other than potentially you see a session get established on an unfamiliar IP address or something that's unexpected. You might have a red flag there, but otherwise it's rather difficult to detect it actually being used. But you would look for activity in those important directories associated with it, which are buried in the file structure under the internet cache typically for the browser.
Awesome. And we've got 1 minute left, so I'll ask one more question and then we'll close things out. We do still have several others, so apologies, guys, for not getting to answer those live. You can expect, like I said, to receive an email from us in the next few business days with your answer. But just to close out with this last question, for device registration, what does the process look like to enroll, enable, and allow for the end user? And are there admin controls to automate the process for end users?
Could you repeat the last part of the question, or repeat the entire question again, just so I hear it correctly?
For device registration, what does the process look like to enroll, enable, and allow for the end user? And are there admin controls to automate the process for end users?
Yeah, so we launched something recently called device health as a trusted endpoint. So what that means is the kind of registration, like I say, registration in airports is basically you are making sure you're marking those devices as trusted. So if you know this, your users are logging in from specific devices, if you are able to get the device identifiers for that device, you can upload them in the Duo admin console, either one by one or by a bulk CSV upload. And that way, those device identifiers are stored in Duo. And device health application is available for download on duo.com. And when the user downloads that health application and installs it, when they log in, the device health app checks for the identifier on the access device and verifies if it's present in the Duo device ID that the IT administrator has uploaded. So if there's a match, only then you allow access from that device. So that's a way that you make sure that only specific devices get access to your applications. And in addition to verifying the device identifiers, you're also checking for health signals, making sure the operating system is up to date. You're making sure your firewall is turned on and things of that nature. So that kind of like coupled with those health policies and managed endpoint policies, you're able to really streamline access for specific devices. And yeah, admin controls are available. The Duo admin console is one of the easiest to use from what I've heard from IT administrators. It's all click-based, no coding required. You can upload device identifiers using a CSV and enable policies in all click-based UI. So it's very simple to do from an admin console perspective.
Awesome. Thank you, Ganesh. All right, guys. Well, we're going to close out the event for today. Thank you for letting us take an extra 2 or 3 minutes of your time. For those of you who stuck around, we really appreciate it. Like I said, sounding like a broken record here, but you guys will receive, for any questions that we didn't get covered, you'll receive an email with your response. You guys will also receive an email within the next 24 hours with the recording to rewatch at your leisure. But other than that, Ganesh, Nick, thank you both so much for the presentation today. Thank you, audience, everyone, for joining. I hope you have a great rest of your week and weekend, and happy holidays. Talk soon. Bye, guys.
Happy holidays. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good one.